Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, global markets reporter at Nasdaq. Joining me to discuss how AI will affect the economy, working people, and business owners is Ryan Abbott, professor of law and health sciences at the University of Surrey School of Law and adjunct assistant professor of medicine at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. Dr. Abbott, it's great to have you with us. Welcome to Trade Talks.
Thanks so much for having me.
And your book, The Reasonable Robot, Artificial Intelligence and the Law, examines the ways that AI will affect the economy and working people as well as business owners. AI can certainly be used for the betterment of society, but you also point out that it can cause social disruption and individual harm in how AI can leave the job market for many workers empty. So let's take a look at both sides of the equation, starting with the benefits and how AI can cure COVID-19 and prevent the next pandemic.
Well, AI is being increasingly used in the life sciences and in drug discovery, in part because some of the tasks of drug discovery are the sorts of things that people used to do, but they're computationally very difficult and complex. So for example, you could take a well-characterized target like COVID-19 and have an AI screen a library of 1 billion possible antibodies to find an antibody or an antibody cocktail that would treat COVID. And in doing that sort of activity, it's changing the way we're finding new drugs, and it is adding inefficiencies to what is otherwise a very slow, expensive, error-prone process. But one of the interesting things about having AI do that is you have two very different legal regimes that apply to human inventors and AI being used to invent. In fact, when an AI invents something, you might not be able to get a patent for it at all, which is a significant concern to drug companies that really rely on patents to make new medicines.
So that's really interesting that you point that out, because when AI does it versus a person doing it, these things are treated very different, which if you want to look even deeper into that, it took a person to develop this AI technology. So, I mean, you can kind of go down that rabbit hole also.
Well, indeed, this raises some really fascinating philosophically, economically, and otherwise based on policy questions about what invention is and who should be involved in it. Certainly AI is being built by a person, but in a sense, I train my PhD students how to go out and do research. And then when they then go off and find new discoveries, I don't get to take credit for that other than as a proud mentor. Or likewise, I have children and teach them how to solve problems, but don't go on to claim credit for the work they've done. Sometimes it might be that someone who builds an AI to solve a problem really is the inventor of that solution. But increasingly, the way AI is getting developed is that you have larger and larger teams spread over time and space, all contributing to giving AI a way to solve a problem. And the people using it to solve a problem may not be the people who programmed it at all. You might also have an AI doing something like saying, here's 10 antibodies that might treat COVID, and then a human team working with them to find which antibody works best. But if you have an AI screen antibody library for COVID, say, this is the best antibody, I know it'll work, I've screened it, and then it turns out that antibody does in fact work, it's less clear who a human inventor for that sort of thing would be.
Interesting. And let's go down another philosophical rabbit hole here. So AI has replaced many service jobs, right? And these are the jobs that have been most impacted by COVID-19 shutdowns. For example, cashiers at fast food restaurants. And that was a trend that was in place prior to COVID-19. It was only accelerated by it. But how are taxes impacted by that? What do states do about revenues? They're not taxing the AI cashiers, are they?
Well, exactly right. As you have AI stepping into the shoes of people, which was really kind of the underlying rationale of AI in the first place, but it's gotten good enough to the point where it's doing this on a wider basis now. All sorts of laws that really weren't designed with AI in mind are now producing perverse sorts of outcomes. So for example, when you go into McDonald's now, half the time you get an automated teller or cashier that's really doing the same job a person is. But when McDonald's automates that job, they don't have to pay payroll taxes for the AI. And what that means is that even if the two are about just as good as each other, tax policy is subsidizing the AI and subsidizing it inefficiently, because McDonald's will be encouraged to automate to avoid paying payroll taxes which otherwise generate social benefits. And there's actually a whole bunch of other ways under the tax code that automation is inefficiently subsidized. So kind of how when the invention example, you have an unequal playing field where AI activity isn't encouraged enough or on the same level as encouraging human innovation. When you have automation for work purposes, AI is actually being overly encouraged, even where it isn't otherwise efficient. And the other strange sort of outcome of that, even though it seems a little ridiculous, is that robots don't pay taxes. And that becomes a problem when you realize that close to 90% of federal tax revenue comes from labor taxes, either payroll taxes or income taxes, and a very small amount of federal income taxes from company taxes. So when McDonald's automates a cashier, if that human cashier is left out of work, you're losing their payroll taxes, they're not paying income taxes. And even if McDonald's becomes more profitable, a very small amount of that is remitted to taxes. And so if we do get widespread automation, which might be pushed along due to human health concerns with COVID, you're going to have a real tax revenue shortage. This is even more a problem as the solution to unemployment from automation is thought to be either retraining people, which takes a lot of revenue, or providing more social services. You know, someday, perhaps even as Andrew Yang was championing in the last presidential primary, a universal basic income if we ever find ourselves in a position where there's just not that much that robots can't do.
All right, well, let me counter you on this one. So would you say AI is taking jobs away from workers? Now, here's my counter to that. Perhaps the workforce, especially in America, needs to overhaul and retrain itself to obtain the skills necessary to complement and excel in the new economy. We did this before with typewriter repair specialists to desktop analysts. So what's the solution here? I mean, I don't think it makes sense to keep training, let's say, that the coal industry, whereas if you look at, electronic vehicles, alternative forms of energy, working with AI, working with machine learning, but training for the appropriate skill sets, that's where you get that revenue back when you have a workforce that's trained to do these jobs.
No, great points to be sure. And for sure, this isn't the first time people have worried about this problem. I mean, these concerns really date back to the first industrial revolution, where it turned out that machines eliminated a lot of jobs, and they are eliminating jobs right now. But at the end of the day, those people found new lines of work, and we all benefited from it. So at the turn of the 19th century, 40% of the population worked in agriculture, the working population, and now it's close to 3%. But we don't have, 38% unemployment or so. Those people have found new jobs. Agriculture's gotten more productive. We've all benefited. And that is a best case scenario in which it all kind of works out in the end. But for the people put out of work, that scant consolation that this is going on to benefit everyone in the long run, these people really do need some intervention to help transition them to new types of jobs, which aren't appearing automatically. Many workers don't have the skill sets needed right now, to go from a coal factory to programming autonomous vehicles. And so there is a need for these sort of interventions to help redirect this workforce. And there's also a concern that it hasn't happened yet, but in the labor automation scholarship that, there are only so many tasks a person can do that a machine can't, right? And machines are always getting better. Machines are always expanding what they can do, and people really aren't. And so it may be in the next couple of decades, we do get to a point where the unemployment rate starts to rise beyond where we really can find a productive use for people. And if we do that, we are going to have to fundamentally rethink how it is that we, think of work and how we reward people, whether that involves shifting to a work week with lower hours, which has never happened yet, or providing people universal basic income so that they can take time and explore new ways of being productive.
Yeah, all excellent points, Dr. Abbott. Thanks so much for joining us on Trade Talks.
Thank you.
And thanks for joining me. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.